Thank you for that kind introduction and, more importantly, the plugs for my books. I'm going to talk about religious discrimination against minorities in Middle Eastern Muslim states. But before we get to that, I'd just like to step back a little bit and look at the larger issue and the context, then focus in a little bit more specifically on the Middle East. Now, first, there's an increasing interest worldwide for religious discrimination. Why? Well, there's a general increasing awareness of the role of religion as an issue in politics. Interestingly enough, in both diplomatic and political circles as well as in academic circles, there's a very strong paradigm that religion is not supposed to be important. When I'm discussing diplomatic and political circles and intellectual circles, I'm of course talking about Western academia and politics. But a number of events have sort of occurred over the years which have made it increasingly difficult to ignore the issue of religion. The Iranian Revolution and the rise of the religious right in the U.S. are probably among the first of them. There's been everybody who collects data on conflict knows there's been a rise in religious conflict. My colleague, Professor BESA, is actually going to be talking about that more specifically. And there's also increasing religious diversity in the West, not just Muslims, other religions also. The nature of sovereignty is changing, especially since the end of the Cold War. Sovereignty is no longer considered an absolute right. How states treat their minorities can become an international issue. And in extreme cases of human rights violations, whether they're against minorities or non-minorities, you can have international intervention. It's not consistent, but it can occur, and it is a justification. You also have increasing monitoring worldwide of religious freedom. The U.S. State Department since 1999 has been issuing a yearly report on religious freedom. I didn't add this to the PowerPoint, but Canada has recently passed a similar law, as have a number of other countries and the EU, which also monitor and place report and put out reports on what is the status of religious freedom or religious minorities around the world. You have new and not so new NGOs focusing on religious freedom around the world. I listed a few of them on the screen. They're certainly not the only ones. Some of them are regional, like Forum 18, which focuses mostly on the former Soviet bloc. You have religious organizations such as the International Christian Concern, when they're much more concerned about the treatment of Christians and other minorities. Then you have general human rights organizations which are looking at religious freedom. You have academic organizations like the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University, not to be confused with UC Berkeley, which is a completely different institution. And they have a very strong religious freedom project. A lot of things are going on, and there's more and more every year. There have been academic efforts at measuring religious freedom, and so I would say violations of religious freedom are monitored and publicized more than ever. Now, so let's start talking about the Middle East. We use the acronym MENA for the Middle East and North Africa, for though mostly I personally don't care, but I have some colleagues who insist North Africa is not part of the Middle East, so we use this acronym to make everybody happy. About 90% of the world's constitutions have some form of religious freedom clause. I've monitored this. This is an exact number. It's like 90.00 something if you actually work it out. The Middle East, depending on exactly when constitutions come in force, come out of force, but I measure them around 2008. 11 of 17 constitutions, a little less than 2/3, have religious freedom clauses. Now, the countries that don't, some of which are really, at least Libya is barely a country right now, but I think they still officially have a constitution. But if we just read the constitutions, these Algeria, Libya, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen have no such clause. Iran has a clause which recognizes specific religious minorities, but does not have a general religious freedom clause. If you are, if I remember correctly, it's Jewish, Christian, or Zoroastrian, you can have some form of religious freedom. If you are not, you can't. If you're in Iran, and that's the Iranian constitution, which is enforced. But most of the constitutions which have religious freedom clauses, and these religious freedom clauses are really most important for minorities. If you are a member of the majority branch of Islam in the country, you have religious freedom, or at least to practice your religion. You might not have the freedom not to practice it, but you certainly have the freedom to practice it. All but two of them somehow qualify the right to religious freedom. Those are Egypt and the Iraq 2005 Constitution, as opposed to the Constitution during the Saddam era. They can be qualified based on you have religious freedom as long as it doesn't contradict the country's customs. That's a pretty broad qualification. You can pretty much restrict anything based on the country's customs. Public order, morality, the country's laws, or accepted standards of behavior. The minute you qualify religious freedom, you're leaving a lot of room to say, well, yes, you have religious freedom, but this particular religious practice or this religion violates, say, public order or the country's customs or morality. So makes the clause irrelevant, although many of these clauses are irrelevant in general in autocratic governments, which is the case of most governments in the Middle East. Now, I measure religious freedom. I don't exactly measure religious freedom. I have a project known as the Religion and State Project. Both books that Professor Reinhold was kind enough to plug for me come out of that project, where I measure government religion policy around the world. I'm going to be discussing just the Middle East, or actually a portion of the Middle East today. And I'm going to be discussing the part of the data where I look at the treatment of religious minorities. And I include every religious minority around the world. Again, in this case, we're just talking about the Middle East, where the minority meets at least 0.25% of the population. I did include some smaller minorities, including all Christian minorities in the Middle East, whether or not they met that population threshold. Most other projects do not have indicators at the minority level, meaning if you look at Freedom House or the Grimm and Finke project, which is now the Pew Forum project, which you might be more familiar with, but it actually originated at Penn State with Roger Grimm and Brian Finke. Sorry, it's Roger Finke and Brian Grimm. I apologize. They have a score for what is the country's religious freedom level in general. And I do that, but I'm not going to be discussing that today. I have a score for each minority because if you look into things, not just in the Middle East, everywhere, countries which discriminate tend to discriminate differentially. Some minorities get it worse than others, or sometimes differently than others. Things that are done to them might be different than are done to another minority. Sometimes it's difficult to really quantify which is worse, whether, say, for example, one minority might not be able to build its places of worship, but another minority might have difficulty bringing clergy into the country. Which is worse? That's very difficult to say, but I can tell you which countries do more things in a more extreme manner to specific minorities than those that do less things or in a less extreme manner than other minorities. And that's really unique to my project. And I want to be very specific about what I'm talking about with religious discrimination. In the book I have coming out in a few months, I devote an entire chapter to what is the question of religious freedom, religious discrimination. It is a topic that everybody believes they know what it means when they hear it, yet I've identified at least 10 or 11 different schools of definitions, each of which have sub-definitions, and they have very different implications. So I'm going to be very specific and say I'm talking about restrictions placed on the religious practices or institutions of a minority group which are not also placed on the majority. So I am not like discussing whether Jews in Turkey have the same economic rights as other Turks. I am asking whether their institutions and their religious practices are allowed to exist or occur to the same extent as Muslims in Turkey. If a government happens to restrict all religions, say including Jews in Turkey and Muslims in Turkey in the same manner, that would not be discrimination. It would be a limitation on religious freedom, but the government is not treating the minority different from the majority, so that's not what I'm looking at in this particular study. I do have measures for that in the larger study, but if you wanted me to talk about the larger study, I would need significantly more time than 20 minutes. I measure 29 specific types of discrimination. All of them are present in the Middle East, save one. I'm going to discuss some of the more common ones. I do not have time to discuss all 29, but if you look at the books that Professor Reinhold mentioned, I do get into every last one of them, not just in the Middle East, around the world. The study, I also want to be clear about what I'm talking about. We're looking at 17 Middle Eastern, North African Muslim majority states, which is basically the entire Middle East, but I'm not including Israel or Lebanon because they are not Muslim majority countries. Lebanon has significant participation of Christians in the government, and I understand that there's some Jews in control of Israel. So I'm looking specifically at Middle Eastern Muslim majority states where Muslims are in control of the government. This is not to say religious discrimination in Israel and Lebanon are not important issues. They are, and they're part of the larger studies. I'm just trying to look at a set of similar countries and draw some conclusions, and Israel and Lebanon are simply not similar in the respects that are important to me. There are 47 religious minorities included in the study. In these countries, most of them are Christian. There's a Christian minority in every single one of the countries. There are 13 Muslim minorities. That would be, say, a Sunni majority in a Shi'i state or a Shi'i majority in a Sunni state. We've also got some Hindu, Buddhist, Baha'i, Sikh, and Druze minorities, which make the population cutoff. I'm still in the process of updating the data set through 2014, so the data here is a little bit dated, but based on what we've collected up to this point, and I even have one of my research assistants sitting in the back listening very attentively. You can wake up now. And these things have not changed all that much. I don't think the results will change all that much when I update it through 2014. If you ask me in 2 or 3 months, I'll be able to give you a more definitive answer. But basically, the interesting point, let's see if we got the pointer, is the Muslims are the least discriminated against minority, and that's actually dropped a bit between 1990 and 2008. That's almost exclusively because the Saddam Hussein regime discriminated heavily against the Shi'i minority, but you don't have a lot of official restrictions on religious practices with the new majority, which is the Shi'i majority, on the Sunni minority. You certainly have some fighting, some killing, some economic stuff, and some individuals who are not associated with the government blowing up mosques, but you don't actually have any government-based discrimination against them. So that's the main reason for the drop. Everything else remains mostly consistent. You see the Christian minorities are at a higher level, but mid, and the other minorities have significantly higher levels of discrimination, which is a very consistent pattern across the countries. Okay, I'll skip this table, not so important. These are the most common forms of restrictions on religious minorities in the Middle East. The most common is proselytizing, mostly against Christians, but also against other minorities. You may not try and convert a Muslim to your religion in most Middle Eastern countries, even though that's something that's considered very important in many religious traditions. A lot of countries restrict the building, repairing, or maintaining places of worship. If you go to a public school, or sometimes even a private school in these countries, and you are not a Muslim, you will still get an education in Islam. And this is not comparative religion. This is religious studies as taught to believers. You have a few countries where you may not proselytize, but it's not illegal to convert to a minority religion if you're a Muslim, at least not officially, but those are both very high. A lot of countries restrict religious publications, such as the Bible. Getting a Bible in a lot of these countries is actually quite difficult, and there are also a lot of restrictions on the ability to publicly observe festivals, holidays, religious ceremonies, and such. I'll give you an example. Here's a typical Muslim minority, the Shia minority in Kuwait, which is about 30% of the population. There are limits on the mosques they can build. They require government approval to build a mosque, very rarely given. Per capita, there's about 12 times as much mosque space for Sunnis as there are for Shia, so it's a very serious restriction. They have mosques, but they're very jam-packed. They are not allowed to train their clergy in the country. People have to leave for training, and periodically the government restricts their ability to celebrate holidays. The holiday of Ashura is a very significant Shia holiday. Some countries are allowed to celebrate it publicly, sometimes they're not. There really seems to be no pattern. Typical Christian minorities, the Copts in Egypt, 10 to 15% of the population. They also need government approval to build or even make minor repairs to their churches, very severely restricted. In the case of mixed marriages, which is always a Muslim father and a Christian mother, because Christian men may not marry a Muslim woman. The Muslim father gets custody of the children. There's routine vilification of Christians in the government press. I'm almost done. There are violent attacks on the Copts periodically, and there's very often police participation in the violent attacks. The police don't protect the Copts. They very often participate in the attacks. There's harassment of converts. It's not actually illegal to convert to Christianity in Egypt, but it may as well be. And there's even more harassment of non-Coptic Christians. So religious discrimination is ubiquitous in these countries, more so than any region in the world, with the possible exception of Eastern European Orthodox Christian states, and even they don't hit these levels, but it's quite ubiquitous there. There are only two groups in the region that do not suffer from discrimination. Both are Muslim minorities, and the scores for most groups are relatively high comparatively to minorities around the world. Religious discrimination is not decreasing, and interestingly, we have a hierarchy. It is consistently lowest against Muslim minorities, higher than Muslims for Christians, and highest for those who are neither Muslims nor Christians. And there are some possible explanations for that. One of them would be the general explanation that you might look at for the high level of religious discrimination is that Muslim countries tend to be non-democratic, and as we all know, non-democratic countries discriminate more. Countries with official religions discriminate more, and most of the countries in the Middle East have official religions. You also have an Islamic doctrine on minorities, in which some minorities, including Christians, are considered acceptable, but other minorities are not. And that might also possibly explain the hierarchy where Christians are discriminated against less than non-Christians, who are not generally included among those minorities that are considered acceptable based on Islamic doctrine. And I believe I timed this perfectly.